Welcome back to the deep dive. There's this specific kind of anxiety that kicks in every 4 years in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
It's usually, 7:00 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. And you're just refreshing a web page, staring at a screen, and you're just desperate for a sign.
You're looking for that crystal ball. It's the holy grail of political science.
Exactly. We want certainty in a process that is, it's inherently chaotic. And because of that, we tend to obsess over patterns.
Hmm.
We look at bellwether counties in Ohio, or we stare at the blue wall, or we analyze diner interviews in swing states. We convince ourselves that if we just look at this one spot, we can unlock the code for the whole country.
It's just human nature.
Yeah.
We hate randomness. We want to believe there's a signal hidden in all the noise.
Well, today we are going to talk about the granddaddy of all political signals. It's a phrase you have almost certainly heard, even if you're not a political junkie. It sounds like this piece of ancient folklore. As Maine goes, so goes the nation.
It really does have a nice ring to it. Sounds so authoritative, like Maine is some kind of mystical oracle tucked away up there that decides the fate of the presidency.
But today we're going to destroy that myth. Or at least we're going to dissect it. We're digging into the history, the data, and the Wikipedia entry for this specific maxim to figure out why it existed, why it worked for a solid century, and then, and this is the fun part, how it just spectacularly crashed and burned.
It's a classic story of data failure, really. It's what happens when you rely on a metric that works perfectly right up until the moment it stops working entirely.
So let's start with the why. If you look at a map, Maine's an outlier. It's geographically isolated, small population, and the winters are not for the faint of heart. So why on earth did anyone think Maine was the predictor?
Well, the magic, if you want to call it that, wasn't political at all. It was purely logistical. It wasn't about who was voting. It was all about when they were voting.
The calendar.
The calendar.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you have to go back to 1820. That's when Maine splits off from Massachusetts, becomes its own state. And right from the jump, they set their election schedule differently. They held their big elections, governor, Congress, in September.
So 2 months before the rest of the country. Why the gap?
It really comes down to what the source material calls the frigid November weather. You have to picture Maine in 1820. No paved roads, no snow plows.
No cars.
No cars, right. Getting to the town square to vote in late November wasn't just a civic duty. It was a survival situation.
Okay, that makes sense. A big snowstorm hits and your turnout just plummets.
It drops to zero. And on top of that, Maine was a big agricultural state, and the harvest cycle ended earlier up there, so it just made practical sense. Get it all done in September while the roads were still passable.
So they voted for governor and Congress in September, but they still voted for president in November like everyone else.
Yes. The presidential election date was set federally. They couldn't change that. But by the time November rolled around, Maine had already elected its entire state government.
Which means the rest of the country got a massive spoiler alert.
A sneak preview. Think about it. In the mid-1800s, you didn't have Gallup polling or, Nate Silver running simulations. You had no hard data except for Maine.
It was the only tangible data point available.
Precisely. If a party did well in Maine in September, it was the only real-world evidence of how voters were feeling about the national platform.
So this whole maxim wasn't just some superstition. It was based on a pretty solid track record, wasn't it?
Oh, it was incredibly accurate for a very long time. The source material points out that between 1820 and 1932, that's a 112-year span, Maine's September results correctly predicted the party that would win the presidency in 21 out of 28 elections.
21 out of 28. That's a 75% success rate. If a stock picker had that record today, they'd be a billionaire.
It's impressive. And that's what built the legend. It really started to catch on around 1840. The Whig Party candidate, a guy named Edward Kent, he wins the governorship in September. 2 months later, the Whig presidential candidate, William Henry Harrison, wins the White House.
Tippecanoe and Tyler, too.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So people started connecting the dots. Then it happens again in 1888. Maine votes solidly Republican in September. Later that year, Benjamin Harrison, a Republican, wins the presidency.
Now, wait a second. My history's a little rusty, but Benjamin Harrison lost the popular vote nationwide that year, didn't he?
He did. Yeah, it's a messy election against Grover Cleveland. But Harrison won the Electoral College. So even in a weird split verdict election, Maine's still technically called the winner. That's when the phrase really got locked into the American lexicon.
Okay, but let's dig into the data here because this is where it gets tricky. You said Maine was pretty heavily Republican for most of that era, right? It wasn't really a swing state.
That is the crucial context. After the Civil War, it becomes a stronghold for the new Republican Party. It was not, Pennsylvania or Florida today. It was deep red, to use our terms.
So here's my question. If Maine is always voting Republican, how does that predict anything? I mean, if a Republican wins Maine and a Democrat wins the presidency, the rule is broken. But if a Republican wins Maine and the nation, isn't that just Maine doing what Maine always does?
And you've just hit on the most sophisticated part of this whole thing. It's the part that pundits today often forget. It wasn't about the identity of the winner in Maine. It was about the margin of victory.
Okay, unpack that for me. How did the margin tell the story?
Think of Maine not as a crystal ball, but more like a barometer for enthusiasm. Everyone knew the Republicans would probably win the governor's race. The real question was, by how much?
So they were looking at the spread, like in sports betting.
Exactly like sports betting. The baseline was Republican win. So if the GOP won Maine by a massive landslide in September, say 20 points or more, that was a signal that the party base was energized, and that momentum would probably carry over to the real swing states in November.
But if they barely scraped by?
That was the danger zone. If the Republicans won, but the margin was narrow, say less than 5%, that was seen as a disaster. It meant the Democrats were overperforming. And if Democrats were overperforming in a stronghold like Maine,
They were probably going to crush it in the states that actually mattered. Wow.
yes. So a close-run Republican victory in September was basically a warning siren for November.
Yeah.
It predicted a Democratic national victory.
That is fascinating. So a Republican win in Maine could actually predict a Democrat in the White House.
It did. And the parties took it so seriously. The source notes they went to considerable lengths to win these elections. They would pour money and resources into Maine in August.
For a state with just a handful of electoral votes, it was all psychological warfare.
100%. It was about shaping the narrative. If you could dominate the headlines in September with a GOP smashes Maine story, you could demoralize the opposition for 2 months.
It works until it doesn't. And this brings us to the villain of our story. The year 1936.
The year the Bellwether broke.
I love this part. It feels like a movie script. You've got the setup, the hubris, and then the fall. So set the scene.
Okay, it's 1936. The Great Depression is in full swing.
Yeah.
FDR is in the White House with the New Deal, and the Republicans are desperate to get back in power. They nominate Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas.
And the Republicans are feeling surprisingly good, right?
They are. And a huge reason for that confidence comes from Maine. In September 1936, the Maine Republicans have a field day. They elect a Republican governor, Louis Barrows. They elect an all-Republican congressional delegation.
A clean sweep.
A total clean sweep. And the party leadership went wild. They thought the tide had turned. They looked at their trusty barometer and saw clear skies ahead.
They were convinced this predicted a national rejection of FDR.
Oh, absolutely. The vice presidential candidate, Frank Knox, actually said, "As Maine goes, so goes the nation," is still the gospel truth. They were trumpeting this everywhere.
So September looks great for them, then November arrives.
And the floor just drops out.
How bad was it?
It wasn't just a loss, it was an annihilation. FDR didn't just win. He won one of the greatest electoral landslides in American history up to that point.
And what happened to Alf Landon, the guy whose party won the Bellwether?
Poor Alf Landon. He carried exactly 2 states.
Let me guess. Maine was one of them.
Maine and Vermont. That's it. Just those 2 states huddled together in the corner. Landon got a total of 8 electoral votes. FDR got 523.
523 to 8. That's astounding.
It is still the smallest electoral vote total for a major party nominee since the 2-party system really began in 1856.
So the Bellwether didn't just fail. It was basically the only place in the country that was wrong. It was perfectly out of sync with America.
It was an island. And the maxim, "As Maine goes, so goes the nation," became an instant joke.
And this gives us one of the absolute best clapbacks in political history from James Farley, FDR's campaign manager.
He didn't miss a beat. When he saw that map, just a sea of blue with 2 little red dots, Farley announced to the press, "As Maine goes, so goes Vermont."
As Maine goes, so goes Vermont. That is just savage.
It was the perfect dismissal. He's saying, sure, you 2 are statistically correlated. You're just totally irrelevant to the rest of us.
And that pretty much killed the superstition on the spot, didn't it?
It shattered the credibility.
Yeah.
If you look at the data after 1936, the correlation just evaporates. Between 1940 and 1956, Maine's September winner only matched the November presidential winner in one of those 5 elections.
1 out of 5. You'd be better off flipping a coin.
Much better. The magic was gone. And finally, in 1959, Maine changed its laws. Since 1960, they voted in November with everyone else. The preview era was officially over.
I want to circle back to that Farley quote for a second. As Maine goes, so goes Vermont. The source material calls them the twin states. Was Farley just making a joke, or is there real data behind that?
No, he was spot on. Mathematically, the political correlation between Maine and Vermont is incredibly strong, almost unnerving.
How strong are we talking?
Since the Republican Party was born in 1854, they've voted for different presidential candidates in the same election only twice.
Wait, only twice in over 150 years?
Only twice. Through the Civil War, the Gilded Age, the Depression, the Cold War, they have walked in lockstep.
Okay, I have to know. What were the two times they broke up?
The first was 1912. That was the Bull Moose election. You had Teddy Roosevelt running as a third-party candidate against the incumbent Republican, Taft.
Right, the great Republican split.
Exactly. Teddy was very popular in Maine, and he split the vote so much that the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, snuck through and won the state. But Vermont stayed loyal to the official Republican candidate, Taft.
So it took a former president blowing up his own party to separate them. What was the second time?
1968. Richard Nixon for the Republicans. Vermont voted for Nixon, but Maine voted for the Democrat, Hubert Humphrey.
Why the split that time?
Humphrey had an ace up his sleeve. His running mate for vice president was Senator Edmund Muskie.
Ah, the favorite son.
Exactly. Muskie was a beloved figure in Maine politics. His presence on the ticket was just enough to flip Maine to the Democrats, while Vermont stayed Republican.
It's pretty telling that it took these extraordinary circumstances to drive a wedge between them. Otherwise, they're politically identical.
It shows deep cultural similarities, although it is worth noting they aren't Republican strongholds anymore.
Right. Today, the Northeast is pretty reliably blue.
And they shifted together. The source notes that starting around 1992, both Maine and Vermont became reliably Democratic in presidential years. So they're still twins, they just switched sides together.
I think there's a bigger lesson here. We started this talking about how much we crave patterns. The Republicans in 1936 weren't being stupid. They had 100 years of data on their side. They were following the trend line.
They were following a trend line that had expired. And that's the danger of political data. It's not physics. Gravity works the same way in 1820 as it does in 1936. But in politics, the underlying variables, demographics, party platforms are constantly shifting.
The as Maine goes maxim worked when the political divide in Maine sort of mirrored the national divide.
Correct. But the New Deal realigned American politics. It brought in coalitions of urban workers and minorities that just didn't really exist in the same way in Maine.
So Maine stood still and the country moved on.
The bellwether didn't break. The flock just flew to a different pasture. And the Republicans missed it because they were looking at the one data point that confirmed what they wanted to believe.
They mistook a local weather report for a national climate forecast.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It really makes you wonder what our Maine is today. We don't use that phrase, but we have others. We talk about the Blue Wall or Bellwether counties. We're always looking for that shortcut.
We absolutely are. The source material mentions things like the Missouri Bellwether. We're always desperate for a simple rule that tells us the whole story so we don't have to deal with the messy complexity of 50 different states.
But the lesson of 1936 is that those shortcuts work right up until the moment they spectacularly fail.
And usually that failure happens during a realigning election when the rules of the game are changing under our feet. That's when the old metrics are most dangerous.
If you're looking at a map from 20 years ago to predict tomorrow, you're going to end up like Alf Landon.
Winning 2 states and becoming a trivia question. Precisely.
So the next time you hear a pundit say, this county has predicted the winner for the last 50 years, maybe take it with a grain of salt.
Or a grain of granite, in Maine's case.
Fair enough. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. A story of frozen roads, margin analysis, and the danger of assuming the future will always look like the past.
A good reminder to always question your assumptions.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Goodbye, everyone.